Plus members save on meeting up with friends. Save on having them over for dinner with free delivery with no hidden fees or markups. That's groceries, plus napkins, plus that vegetable chopper to make things a bit easier. Plus, members save on gas to go meet them in their neck of the woods. Plus, when you're ready for the ultimate sign of friendship, start a show together with your included Paramount Plus subscription. Walmart Plus members save on this plus so much more. Start a 30-day free trial at walmartplus.com. Paramount Plus Essential Plan only. Separate registration required. See Walmart Plus terms and conditions.
This episode is brought to you by Busy Bone Dog Treats. When your busy day sounds like this, but your dog sounds like this, just open a bag of Busy Bone Dog Treats, slide out a Busy Bone, and bask in your newfound ability to keep your dog busy. When life gives you busy, give your dog Busy Bone.
Welcome to the Philosophemes podcast, where we do philosophy the traditional way. I'm your host, Dr. Frank Scalambrino. So grateful you're here. The Philosophemes podcast is proudly part of the Evergreen Podcast Network. If you're looking for excellent podcasts, you'll find them on Evergreen. Thank you for supporting and sharing this educational podcast. Any political or religious ideas discussed in this episode are solely for the sake of philosophical education. Everyone is welcome here on the Philosophemes podcast.
This podcast episode originally aired on Dr. Frank Scalambrino's previous podcast, Basic Philosophical Questions.
All right. Hello, friends and fellow students of philosophy. I just wanted to make a quick little announcement here before I get into this podcast. First, I want to say thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate you listening to the podcast, and I really appreciate your comments and questions over on YouTube. So please keep that going. I really do enjoy it. And, I just wanted to say that when I first put this episode together on the previous podcast, I was unaware of the podcast Practical Stoicism, and I was unaware of Tanner Campbell. So I just wanted to say up front that, and make it explicit, that I enjoy Tanner's podcast, Practical Stoicism, and I think he's doing an excellent job over there. I don't know Tanner personally. I hope to get to know him better over time and maybe even be on his show, or he can be on my show, talk about Stoicism. I think that would be fun. But I just wanted to say that, anything critical that is being said in this podcast episode about Stoicism, really where it comes from is this idea that there are many Stoic instructors out there, many teachers of Stoicism out there who don't give credit where credit is due. So, for example, this was the reason why I really wanted to stress that Amor Fati belongs to existentialism and that Amor Fati belongs to Nietzsche. Because it just seems to me that not only is it a very shabby way to do philosophy if you just kind of willy-nilly attribute positions to any philosopher you want or, whatever, but also because Nietzsche, in essence, as I mentioned in the Three Metamorphoses of Spirit podcast episode, Nietzsche, in essence, sacrificed his life to be able to provide this philosophy to us and for us. And it just seems, that there's something radically wrong, many things radically wrong with this idea of not giving him credit for his own philosophy. So I just, want to say up front that really what prompted me was seeing so many teachers of Stoicism talking about Amor Fati as if it belongs to Stoicism. And Amor Fati does not belong to Stoicism. Amor Fati belongs to existentialism, and it is the creation of Friedrich Nietzsche. So just wanted to get that out and make sure that we're all on the same page. As I said, you'll hear here in a moment, at the beginning of the podcast, I do admire Stoicism. There's many things about Stoicism that I think are absolutely excellent. And, there are many things about Tanner Campbell's Practical Stoicism podcast that I think are excellent. I like this emphasis on virtue ethics as well. I feel as though there are so many teachers of Stoicism out there who take a utilitarian approach to Stoicism. And, that is a very significant philosophical mistake. I just wanted to emphasize that this is in no way, shape, or form an attack on Tanner Campbell's Practical Stoicism. I like that podcast. I enjoy listening to that podcast whenever I have time to listen to it. This is really just trying to give credit where credit is due. So hopefully down the road, we'll be able to talk some more about Stoicism. Thank you again.
In this episode, we discuss existentialism versus Stoicism. All right, so this episode is near and dear to my heart. And this episode, there are so many implications for the distinctions that we're going to examine and discuss in this episode. I feel as though I need to make just a few comments before we begin, because it's important to recognize that this is not just about philosophy. I wrote a book in 2017, or that is titled The Philosophical Principles of the History and Systems of Psychology. And I had the honor of teaching the course by that same name at the Chicago School of Professional Psychology in downtown Chicago. This topic is intimately related to psychology. Existentialism and Stoicism have a deep role to play in psychology and in thinking about psychology. Additionally, of course, this points to the history of philosophy. And also, I would suggest, as you'll see, it's very clear that this distinction also is intimately involved in philosophical thinking about theory in general. Existentialism and Stoicism are mutually exclusive theoretical paradigms. I recently put together an episode on paradigms and paradigm shifts. So it might be helpful to go back and take a look at that episode as well. It's very helpful for understanding, as we're going to see here, that the distinction between existentialism and Stoicism is absolute and rock solid. So it's not vague and you can't mix them up, right? Now, in particular, what I see is that it has become very popular to talk about Stoicism. I can't remember the guy's name. I think it's Ryan Holiday. Every once in a while, I'll see an article online. It says something like how some person made $1 million off of Stoic philosophy. And so there is some sense in which many people are advocating for Stoicism these days. I think that many people do not advocate for existentialism because they don't know what existentialism is. The primary mistake made in regard to existentialism is to think that existentialism is the philosophy of Jean-Paul Sartre. And that's a mistake, right? Sartre is just one of the existentialists, and existentialism was around way before Sartre started to philosophize. So we can't go into all of that here, but hopefully this episode will be able to shine a light on the paradigmatic distinction between existentialism and Stoicism. And if you're able to recognize that, then whenever you think about Stoicism or you think about existentialism, not only will your thinking be correct, your ability to distinguish between the two and to distinguish between the two in the thinking of others will be greatly increased in power. So we're going to go ahead and jump right in, but I thought it was important to say those things up front. Okay, here we go. So there's going to be some general thoughts on Stoicism, and I do want to say some general things right now. And I'm saying these things because I want to make sure that you situate me correctly in relation to these philosophies. And so I'm not some sort of Stoic hater, or I'm not some sort of Stoicism hater, right? I feel like, that's the kind of thinking that, I guess you could expect from somebody who's not a very careful thinker. What I believe I'm doing is I believe that I am doing philosophy, right? I believe that I am explicating these ideas for you and explicating the distinction between these ideas for you, and then reconstellating these distinctions in ways such that you can see these ideas more accurately, right? And that you can use these ideas in a more coherent and clear way. I really do believe that that's what I'm doing, okay? So I just want to say that because I'm sure that there are plenty of people who think that this is for the purpose of being aggressive toward Stoics or something, but that's not the case. It's not. So let's praise Stoicism for a moment. The discipline aspect of Stoicism is, in my opinion, excellent and beautiful. The Roman Stoics are exemplars of what I would refer to as virtuous masculinity, right? So if there is such a thing as toxic masculinity, I think the Roman Stoics can show you its opposite, which would be virtuous masculinity. And especially Seneca and Marcus Aurelius. But I love Seneca. I mean, when you read Seneca, I kind of feel as though the same kind of way that I feel when I read Schopenhauer, right? Despite the fact, as we're about to learn, that there's a significant and paradigmatic distinction and difference between their philosophies. But I wanted to say those things up front, right? So that I really do find some things to be excellent and beautiful in Stoicism. All right. Existentialism and Stoicism refer to two incommensurable paradigms. So technically, you cannot be an existentialist if you are a Stoic. I'm going to make sense of that for you in a second. You could be a Stoic, you could be Stoic, not a Stoic, but Stoic, and with the lowercase s. You could be Stoic as an existentialist, but you could not endorse both Stoicism and existentialism on philosophical grounds, right? So if there is some, let's put it this way, right? If there's some event or if there is some choice that we are faced with, and we are going to say, well, what would an existentialist do and what would a Stoic do? The ways in which the existentialist and the Stoic would conceive of the event or conceive of the choice would be so significant if you're doing it in a philosophically coherent way. I mean, some people it's just like, whatever. Hey, Sigmund Freud says, feed your cat chicken liver. You know what I mean? If you're one of those individuals, then there's nothing I can do for you. But if you're concerned that you're thinking coherently, and if you are considering these philosophies in a coherent and consistent way, are mutually exclusive. And so therefore, to use these philosophical points of view to consider some event or a choice would be to consider them in mutually exclusive, paradigmatically distinct ways. Okay, we're going to make sense of all of that. And I think it is actually really helpful, and it may even be faster to think about this in terms of psychology, or specifically psychotherapy. So on the relationship between their representative modes of psychotherapy. And of course, the representative modes of psychotherapy for Stoicism and existentialism are CBT and existentialism. There's a rabbit hole here in regard to humanistic, existential, phenomenological approaches to psychotherapy, but that we have to save that for another time. I mean, right now what we're doing is we're focusing on the distinction between the philosophy of Stoicism and the philosophy of existentialism. And so what we find, and this is not controversial at all, this is plastered standardly and universally across all textbooks of psychotherapy, and all textbooks of, the history and systems of psychology, that CBT originates from Stoicism. So CBT and REBT are essentially sister forms of psychotherapy, and they participate in the same paradigm: cognitive behavioral therapy and rational emotive behavioral therapy. Notice that both of them include the word behavior. So The founder of CBT is Aaron Beck, and the founder of REBT is Albert Ellis. Both Aaron Beck and Albert Ellis are on the record in writing saying that CBT and REBT respectively originate from Stoic philosophy. We'll see some of the examples here in a moment. But again, this is not at all controversial, right? And then, of course, the existential psychotherapists, I mean, it's even there in the name, but the existential psychotherapists, of course, acknowledge that existential psychotherapy originates from existential philosophy. All right. So we're going to look at the distinction between CBT and existential psychotherapy, and then we're going to consider both the positives and negatives of this difference. And this was one of this next item here, this was really one of the motivating factors for putting this together, was just this you constantly see people talking about Stoic philosophy trying to appropriate Amor Fati from existentialism, right? They're trying to take it from existentialism and claim that it is a part of Stoic philosophy. And in truth, it cannot be. It isn't. And we'll see why here in a moment. But so you could think of this distinction: if Amor Fati belongs to existentialism, then what is it that they're trying to say? What is it that the Stoics are trying to say, or these people advocating for Stoic philosophy? And what they're trying to say is something like apatheia ad fatum, apathy toward fate. We'll see this here in a moment. Also, we want to ask the question, and this is the reason why I have Nietzsche up here instead of some other existential philosopher, although we're going to look at the others here in a moment. The question, is Stoicism slave mentality? Nietzsche certainly seemed to think so. One of the examples I want to look at here is the example of chronic pain. And I'm hoping that by looking at this example, it will actually further concretize this for you. It'll make it easier to see. Next, we're going to ask the question, is Stoicism nihilistic? Then we're going to look at Kierkegaard's critique of Stoic theology, Nietzsche's critique of Stoic ontology. Ultimately, when he says things like the Stoics want to be natural or live in accordance with nature, his critique is that, and this is the existentialist critique in general, is that nature is more than an idea. And so we're going to see that this is a criticism of this idea that the Stoics want to live in accordance with nature, because it seems as though they want to live in accordance with an idea of nature, according to Nietzsche. Lastly, then we're going to look at Heidegger and Sartre's critiques of Stoicism. And this is going to move pretty quick. That's why I just wanted to get this information in front of you so that you could be able to correctly philosophize about this, but also to correctly think through the differences between existentialism and Stoicism. So here we go. So then, points of incommensurability. And again, I encourage you to take a look at the episode. It's a quick episode on paradigms and paradigm shifts. What we suggest there is that these points of incommensurability are very important, these hinge points, if you will, between theories. So when you can find one of these hinge points, it then becomes possible for you to sort of immediately recognize this idea or this claim. Does it belong to existentialism or does it belong to Stoicism? Notice here that Stoics are materialists and that existentialism is a transcendental philosophy. That's a hinge point. Notice that Stoics are determinists and that existentialism is based on free will. So that's another hinge point. It's another point of incommensurability between these two philosophical paradigms. It's another point of incommensurability between these two philosophical points of view. Then lastly, Stoics seek to avoid passion. And this is very important, right? That Stoics seek to avoid passion, and that existentialism affirms passion. It affirms passion and tragedy. So again, this is another point of incommensurability. You'll see how these play here in a moment. On the relationship between their representative modes of psychotherapy, the paradigmatic modes of psychotherapy associated with Stoicism, cognitive behavioral therapy, and rational emotive behavioral therapy. The CBT, this is important, the CBT critique of existential therapy is that existential therapy is concerned with issues that don't matter. For example, these are the actual examples that are usually given, standardly given. For example, establishing rapport, right? When a therapist wants to establish rapport with their client or their patient, and with meaningfulness, with meaning making, like sort of phenomenological term. So notice then that CBT critiques existential therapy by saying that establishing rapport and being concerned with meaningfulness or meaning making, that those are considered mistakes from the point of view of CBT. And so philosophically speaking about this, we could say that these are considered mistakes from the point of view of Stoicism. And if you take a look, I think some of these guys are just sort of puffed up and think that they're cynics or something. They want to pretend to be Diogenes or something like that. But if you look at the way that some of these so-called professors of Stoic philosophy respond to comments that are made in regard to their presentations, then you recognize that clearly they're not very concerned with meaningfulness and certainly not rapport, right? The existentialist critique of CBT is that CBT is designed to, quote, help you tolerate your cubicle, end quote. So this echoes the philosophical critique that Stoicism is for slaves, or that Stoicism is slave mentality. And of course, Epictetus was a slave. Nietzsche plays with this, right? That Epictetus's philosophy is the philosophy of a slave. And so therefore, of course, it is for slaves, and it is a philosophy of slave mentality.
Walmart Plus members save on meeting up with friends. Save on having them over for dinner with free delivery with no hidden fees or markups. That's groceries, plus napkins, plus that vegetable chopper to make things a bit easier. Plus, members save on gas to go meet them in their neck of the woods. Plus, when you're ready for the ultimate sign of friendship, start a show together with your included Paramount Plus subscription. Walmart Plus members save on this plus so much more. Start a 30-day free trial at walmartplus.com. Paramount Plus Essential Plan only. Separate registration required. See Walmart Plus terms and conditions.
And so, as you will see, that existentialism is going to suggest something like what CBT is aiming at is merely helping you tolerate your cubicle. We're going to look at chronic pain as an example, and I think that'll clear this up. It's very helpful. Notice that this is, I mentioned this already, the Amor Fati versus the apatheia ad fatum. So here we have apathos, right? So the A refers to the alpha privative in Greek, which means not. And of course, pathos is passion. So apathy in this ancient Greek context or Stoic context that we're looking at here means something like to not be filled with passion in regard to your fate. And so that is the Stoic relation to fate, not the love of fate, especially if we understand love as a kind of passion, right? So apathy here means no pathos. In other words, precisely the opposite of the love of fate. So another little slogan we see here is often memento mori. Now, memento mori, this idea of remember that you will die, right? This is good, and it applies to both Stoicism and existentialism, but does not go far enough, right? So yeah, you should remember that you're mortal, but it really, and this is the existentialist critique or expansion of this idea, it needs to be, I own this death, right? So we can say something like, from remember that you will die to I appropriate this death. I make this death my property. And we will see what this means a little bit more explicitly here in a second. So the idea of appropriating or owning one's own death refers to the choice involved, which Stoics do not believe in, right? So again, memento mori is good, but it doesn't go far enough. Is Stoicism slave mentality? So Stoicism is deterministic. So if you are a Stoic, then you are supposed to believe that whatever happens to you was already determined to happen. It was fated, right? And therefore you are supposed to accept it. You are supposed to tolerate it, not love it, though, as we just saw on the previous slide, because passion is considered bad, right? That's why it's rational, emotive behavioral therapy, right? Getting the emotions under control with rationality. And again, I think CBT is still number one amongst the paradigms. And certainly people are evidently, I guess, making way more money off Stoicism than they're making off existentialism. But that doesn't mean that just because something's popular doesn't mean that it's the best. Okay, so at times, though, it is important to get yourself under control. And I would say that if you don't have control of yourself, we could be pragmatic about this. That if you don't have control of yourself, that sort of whatever works in helping you get control of yourself and understand what it looks like to have control of yourself, you need to be able to tolerate your cubicle so that you can think clearly inside your cubicle about meaningfulness. So it could be the case that, whenever I would be involved in psychotherapeutic relations to individuals, clients, patients, and so forth, I find myself pointing out what CBT would refer to as thinking errors. So I do think that it is important and helpful to point things like this out to people, but ultimately I want to go toward this paradigm of meaningfulness. And as you can see, this affirmation of meaningfulness and the meaningfulness of one's existence. So, and that move right there that we just went through, I see that as echoing at the very beginning of this talk. We said that it is possible to be stoic as an existentialist, right? And I think that that's what that is. It's not being a stoic, it's being stoic as an existentialist, right? Because again, you can't be both. All right, so pathos is considered bad. Passion is considered bad by the Stoics because it gets in the way of clear reasoning. Nietzsche points out that Epictetus was first and foremost a slave, and therefore his philosophy is the philosophy of a slave, that is, slave mentality. And of course, that's correct. So lastly, yet it is also slave mentality because it teaches you to do what you're supposed to do. Now again, being a reckless, out of control maniac might be fun in the short run, but it's not good in the long run. And Aristotle, clearly teaches that. So there is value in being able to do what you're supposed to do, right? If you can't control yourself enough to sit down and read a book, well, then you're probably not going to be much of a philosopher. So if you need Stoic philosophy to get yourself under control to be able to read a book, then that's good, right? When you're reading that book, though, when you're concerned with things like meaningfulness and so on and so forth, then, maybe there's a sense in which we leave Stoic philosophy behind. Okay, is Stoicism slave mentality? And here is the example of chronic pain. All right, so take, for example, the famous Epictetus dictum, which became the centerpiece of rational emotive behavioral therapy. And by the way, I have to say, since I originated, I started in psychology. I have spent, and I've worked in mental health a lot, many, many years, at all levels of care and in administration. So I have spent lots of time around psychologists. I have spent lots of time around psychiatrists. I've broken bread with these people and, chatted with them over lunch and in hallways many, many, many times, right? So, and also many of my students are now licensed psychologists all around the world. So, surrounded by psychology and psychologists. So when I say these things, I'm not just picking low-hanging fruit, right? I'm saying these things because I think that they are true, and my experience has been also that they are true, and they are philosophically relevant for us. So I just want to say that so that people can't just try to poo-poo what it is that I'm saying. I have a deep background in this. You can Go check it out if you'd like. So what I want to say then, with this grand disclaimer, is that psychologists love to apply this, what I'm calling dictum from Epictetus here, and that is that, is it really the thing, or is it really the event, or is it just your perception of it? And also, psychologists like to make the logical fallacy mistake in regard to this, which is psychologizing, by the way. And they want to say something like, well, it's just your perception. It's just your perception. And it's just like, well, it can't just be your perception, because there's a distinction to be made between your perception and reality. There is a real event, there is a real thing, and then there is your perception of the event and your perception of the thing. But it is psychologistic to think that your perception of the event or your perception of the thing somehow nullify the reality of the event or the thing. So anyway, this is important for us to understand how Stoicism approaches this example of chronic pain. We see then, now, pain is pain. So if we're talking about pain, then it's painful, right? So the Stoic stance is that you should tolerate and endure your pain. So if you find it to be painful, just tolerate it by changing your perception of it, right? And I do think that there is some sense in which this works, right? There is some sense in which this works. The problem, however, is that if you can't advance beyond this, right? So, in contrast, existentialism holds that you should own your pain, that it is your pain that defines you, and it is your pain that is the result of your choices. So, the Stoic position takes weakness and negativity as a point of origin, and existentialism takes freedom and the affirmation of one's choices as a point of origin, right? So, in other words, to say something like, I'm going to be disciplined enough to tolerate my pain, is to overlook the meaning that is implicit and inherent in that Stoic relation, whereas the Stoic does not question. And philosophically, this should make obvious sense to you, right? Whereas the Stoic does not question the meaningfulness of the pain, the existentialist does. All right, so is Stoicism nihilistic, right? Well, we're going to take a look at some of these ideas from Nietzsche and Kierkegaard. Stoicism's slave soteriology and so-called natural ontology make it nihilistic, at least from the point of view of existentialism. For example, Nietzsche points out that the Stoics want to live in accordance with nature. However, they treat nature as a concept. In other words, what Stoics consider nature is not true nature. According to Kierkegaard, Stoic slave soteriology is not true salvation. Put more simply and bluntly, Stoics don't understand God. Stoics neither correctly understand divinity, nor do they correctly relate to divinity. Stoics are ontological nihilists, and Stoics are soteriological nihilists. Heidegger and Sartre on Stoicism, and I had considered, again, this would become a very large seminar had I wanted to, explicate the primary sources that this comes from, but I just wanted to put this on the table for you so that you would be able to think in terms of these ideas. So Heidegger's critique, and this makes perfect sense, is that Stoics overly rationalize Dasein. In a sense, this is not anything different from what Kierkegaard and Schelling and Schopenhauer and Nietzsche would say, especially Schelling, Kierkegaard, and Nietzsche. But still, it's worth seeing, right? That Heidegger's critique of Stoicism is that Stoics overly rationalize Dasein. And of course, Dasein is being here or there, being there, here. Sartre's critique is that Stoics are evasive and in denial, right? The intricacies of Sartre's critique are complicated, and I'm not going to pursue them here because it would just take too much time. If you're interested in understanding the background to this, you can take a look at my book, What is Existentialism? The 2-volume What is Existentialism? There will be a link to it in the description if you would like to take a look at my book, What is Existentialism? In sum, Stoics deny free will, evading their responsibilities. Stoicism is slave mentality, slave soteriology, and over-rationalizes the meaning of existing. Amor Fati does not belong in Stoicism. I hope that puts Stoicism and existentialism into the proper context for you. It is very important to recognize that they are mutually exclusive philosophical points of view. And I also think that it's very helpful to recognize how this plays out in terms of psychotherapy. All right, please subscribe to the Philosophemes YouTube channel. And if you'd like to see the Philosophemes in puzzle form, the handle on Instagram is @Philosophemes. All right. We are posting videos on YouTube and X, selling books on Amazon, and you can see the Philosophemes in puzzle form on Instagram. I appreciate your questions and comments and your support of this open access educational podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Frank Scalambrino, and I'll see you in the future.
This is Mark.
And this is Wes,
We'd like to tell you about Close Reads.
a philosophy podcast where we comment on philosophy texts in real time.
We give you the experience of reading very difficult verbiage without you having to actually do that.
We cover the big names and the figures you've always wanted to know more about.
And share our insights from 15 years running the Partially Examined Life podcast, downloaded over 50 million times.
Join us.
On Close Reads.
Ever heard of Stoicism? Chances are, if you have, you've heard of Stoicism with a lowercase s and not Stoicism with an uppercase S. Lone wolves, no emotions, antisocial behavior, cold indifference. All that is Stoicism with a lowercase s. Stoicism with an uppercase S is the ancient Greek philosophy and virtue ethics framework that centers on service to the cosmopolis, to include your family, friends, community, and planet, and the development of a good moral character. My name is Tanner Campbell, and I'm the host of Practical Stoicism, a 3 times a week podcast teaching Stoic principles and concepts to anyone interested through the exploration of texts and deep dives into various moral topics. You can find Practical Stoicism where you're already listening to podcasts by searching for Practical Stoicism or by going to stoicismpod.com. I invite you to give it a listen today. You just might like it.